The bodies were still warm when the lies began. September 13th, 1971. Attica Correctional Facility, New York. State police fire 3,000 rounds in 4 minutes. 43 people dead. Blood pooling on concrete. Tear gas choking the air. Within hours, officials tell the media that rioting inmates slit the throats of hostages. One guard, they claim, was castrated. The story spreads like wildfire. Savage prisoners. Heroic rescue attempt. Tragic, but necessary force. 24 hours later, the medical examiner walks into a room full of reporters. Dr. John Edland's hands don't shake as he reads his findings. Every single hostage killed by bullets. Not knives. Not inmates. Bullets fired by law enforcement. The cover-up had failed before it even started. But the question nobody was asking cut deeper than any blade. What made over 1,000 men so desperate they were willing to die rather than return to their cells? The answer was buried in 4 years of ignored warnings. Beaten prisoners. Destroyed evidence. A 99-page handwritten complaint that predicted everything. And when the bloodshed finally came, it wasn't random violence. It was the inevitable explosion of a system designed to break human beings. This is the story they tried to bury. Real quick, what you just saw is only the beginning. If you want the full story about America's most secure prison, subscribe and turn on notifications right now. Hit the like button so this reaches more people. These investigations take months to verify, and most channels won't touch them. Let's continue. By the summer of 1971, Attica wasn't just overcrowded, it was suffocating. 2,200 men crammed into a facility built for 1,600. 1 shower per week. 1 roll of toilet paper per month. Censored mail. 15 cents a day for labor. And for the Black and Puerto Rican inmates, who made up more than half the population, guards who saw them as less than human. But overcrowding doesn't explain what happened. Plenty of prisons were packed. What made Attica different was the disconnect between what inmates could see and what they were told was impossible. The courts had already said the conditions violated the Constitution. Reports documented the filth, the abuse, the complete absence of rehabilitation programs. A New York Committee on Crime and Correction issued a warning in January 1971. Violence was coming. Nobody with the power to change anything did a thing. The inmates watched their complaints disappear into bureaucratic black holes. They read about prisoners' rights movements in other states. They saw George Jackson, a Black Panther and prison activist, shot dead during an alleged escape attempt at San Quentin in August 1971. His writings had circulated through Attica. His death felt personal. On August 22nd, over 700 Attica inmates staged a hunger strike in Jackson's honor. 1 day of silent solidarity. The administration took no action, no dialogue, no acknowledgement. By September, the tension was visible. Guards felt it. Inmates felt it. Everyone knew something was going to break. The question was when. September 8th. The prison recreation yard. 2 inmates started roughhousing. Just typical prison horseplay, the kind that happened every day. But a guard saw it differently. He saw a fight. He called for backup. What happened next was routine. 2 inmates sent to disciplinary confinement. Standard procedure. Except it wasn't standard anymore. Word spread through the cell blocks that night. The 2 men had been punished for nothing. The guard had overreacted, and nobody was going to do anything about it because nobody ever did anything about it. The next morning, September 9th, a lieutenant approached a group of inmates after breakfast. Time to return to your cells. One of the inmates was involved in yesterday's incident. He refused. Other inmates backed him up. The lieutenant grabbed him. Everything that had been building for years ignited in seconds. Inmates rushed the lieutenant. Guards tried to intervene. More inmates joined in. Within minutes, a spontaneous riot was spreading through the prison like a lit fuse racing toward dynamite. Officers were overwhelmed. Inmates smashed through a gate that had a faulty weld, the kind of maintenance issue that gets ignored in an underfunded facility. Suddenly, they had access to Times Square, the central area connecting all 4 cell blocks. Lieutenant Richard Maroney barely made it to the gate controls. He sealed the area, trapping inmates in the corridors, but preventing a total prison break. It didn't stop the violence. Officer William Quinn tried to help a colleague being attacked. Inmates beat him with fists, feet, anything they could grab. They threw him from a second-story window. Quinn would die 2 days later from his injuries. The first fatality of Attica. By mid-morning, state police had secured 3 cell blocks. But 1,281 inmates controlled the yard, the massive outdoor exercise area, and they had 42 hostages. What happened in Diyard over the next 4 days wasn't the chaos authorities would later claim. It was organization, structure, democracy even. The inmates knew they had crossed a line. Taking hostages meant there was no easy way back. So they did something remarkable. They created order out of upheaval. Elections. Actual elections. Inmates voted for representatives to speak for them in negotiations. Frank Big Black Smith, a respected figure who'd been in segregation when the riot started, was appointed head of security. His job, keep the hostages alive and keep hotheads from making things worse. 21-year-old Elliot L.D. Barkley emerged as a powerful voice, an orator who could command attention, articulate demands, and keep over 1,000 angry men focused on the goal. Meaningful change, not just revenge. The hostages were blindfolded and held in a tight circle in the yard. Inmates armed with makeshift weapons, clubs, and knives stood guard, but Big Black made it clear the hostages were leverage, not targets. Anyone who hurt them would answer to him. It was an impossible balancing act. Some inmates wanted blood. Others wanted escape. But the leadership held. They drafted demands. 28 of them. Better food. Adequate medical care. More than 1 shower a week. An end to censorship. Religious freedom. Due process in disciplinary hearings. Fair wages for prison labor. The right to political organization. All demands that, on paper, seemed reasonable. Some were rights guaranteed by law that Attica simply wasn't providing. They also demanded specific people to negotiate with. Journalists, politicians, lawyers, Tom Wicker from the New York Times, Congressman Herman Badillo, people who would witness what was happening and couldn't be silenced later. New York Correction Commissioner Russell Oswald agreed to come. He listened. He even agreed to most demands. Food would improve. Programs would be restored. Conditions would be addressed. But 2 demands stopped everything cold. First, complete amnesty. No prosecutions for anyone involved in the riot. Oswald couldn't promise that. The assault on Officer Quinn, who was now dying in a hospital, guaranteed someone would face murder charges. Second, removal of Attica's superintendent. The inmates wanted Vincent Mancusi out. They saw him as the symbol of everything wrong with the prison. Oswald refused to let inmates dictate who ran the facility. Negotiations stalled. Hours turned into days. Outside, hundreds of state troopers surrounded the prison. Inside, the yard's makeshift community continued. Inmates shared food. They held meetings. They debated strategy. Some prepared for a fight they knew they couldn't win. The observers, civilian volunteers who'd agreed to witness negotiations, tried desperately to broker a solution. They pleaded with Governor Nelson Rockefeller to come to Attica. A personal appearance, they argued, would show good faith, might break the impasse. Rockefeller refused. He'd been consulting with President Richard Nixon, who saw the riot as part of a larger threat. Radical prisoners, Black Panthers, anti-war protesters, a breakdown of law, an order that needed to be crushed. On September 12th, Oswald gave the inmates one more chance. Accept the agreed-upon reforms. Release the hostages. Surrender peacefully. The inmates held a vote. They could see the troopers massing outside. They knew what refusal meant. But they also knew that surrendering without amnesty meant some of them would spend their lives in prison for taking a stand. They voted to continue. That night, inmates fortified their position. They gathered bricks, clubs, anything that might serve as a weapon. They knew what was coming. Some wrote final messages to families. Others made peace with the likelihood they wouldn't survive the morning. In a tent outside Dillard, state police loaded their weapons. Shotguns with buckshot. No rubber bullets. No tear gas to disperse first, then storm in. Just overwhelming lethal force. The decision had been made. Rockefeller ordered the prison retaken by any means necessary. Monday, September 13th, 9:30 a.m. The rain had started overnight. Dillard was slick with water. Inmates stood in formation, awaiting the ultimatum they knew was coming. Through a megaphone, an official read the final order. Release the hostages within the hour. Surrender, or the prison will be retaken by force. The inmates' response was clear. 8 blindfolded hostages were brought to the catwalks on top of the prison walls. Inmates held knives to their throats. A visual answer. We're not backing down. 15 minutes later, at 9:46 a.m., a helicopter appeared overhead. The inmates looked up. Some raised fists in defiance. Others gripped their makeshift weapons tighter. Then the gas canisters dropped. Tear gas flooded Dillard. Thick, choking clouds that turned the open field into a fog of chemical warfare. Inmates scattered, coughing, blinded. The hostages, still blindfolded, had no idea what was happening. Then came the shooting. State police and corrections officers opened fire from the walls, from the guard towers, from the ground. Shotguns loaded with buckshot, rifles, handguns, 3,000 rounds in 4 minutes. The buckshot didn't discriminate. It tore through inmates who were fighting, inmates who were surrendering, inmates trying to flee. It ripped through the hostages who authorities claimed they were rescuing. An emergency medical technician who entered afterward described seeing a wounded inmate lying on the ground. A state trooper walked up, shot him multiple times in the head at point-blank range. The inmate hadn't been resisting. He couldn't have been. He was already dying. Another prisoner, hit 7 times, was ordered to crawl. When he moved too slowly, an officer kicked him. The 4 minutes of shooting ended. Silence fell over Dillard, broken only by moaning. Smoke from spent ammunition mixed with tear gas. Bodies everywhere. 29 inmates dead. 10 hostages dead. 89 people wounded. Every single person killed by law enforcement gunfire. Not by inmates. By the people sent to rescue them. But that's not what the public heard. Within hours of the shooting, New York Department of Corrections spokesman Gerald Houlihan stood before a room full of reporters. His statement was clear, confident, and completely false. Inmates had killed the hostages. They'd slit their throats. One guard had been castrated. The prisoners had shown their true savage nature. The state police had done what was necessary to save lives. The story ran in every newspaper. It played on every television broadcast. Savage inmates. Heroic police. Tragic but necessary violence. The narrative was set. There was only one problem. The bodies. Monroe County Medical Examiner Dr. John Edland performed the autopsies. Methodical, thorough, scientific. What he found contradicted everything officials had claimed. Not a single hostage had their throat cut. Not one. Every hostage had died from bullets, shotgun pellets, high-caliber rounds, wounds consistent with the weapons carried by state police and corrections officers. On September 14th, less than 24 hours after the assault, Dr. Edland went public. His medical findings were unambiguous. The inmates hadn't killed the hostages. The police had. The attempted cover-up collapsed instantly, but the damage was done. Families of the dead hostages had already been told their loved ones died at the hands of prisoners. They'd already mourned believing that lie. When the truth came out, it felt like losing them all over again. The backlash was immediate. Congressional investigations were launched. Public condemnation poured in. How could state officials lie about something so easily disproven? Why would they? The answer was simple: optics. Rockefeller and Nixon needed the Attica assault to be justified. They needed the inmates to be monsters who deserved what they got. They needed the public to support overwhelming force against prison uprisings. A narrative where police killed everyone, including the people they were supposedly rescuing, didn't fit that need. So they lied. But the lies kept going. Even after the truth about the hostages came out, authorities covered up what happened next. In the week following the assault, corrections officers exacted revenge on the surviving inmates. They forced prisoners to run a gauntlet of nightsticks, being beaten from all sides. They made them crawl naked across broken glass. They tortured them in ways designed to humiliate and terrorize. Injured inmates received minimal medical treatment. Some were left in cells bleeding for hours before anyone looked at their wounds. The message was clear: you challenged us, and this is what happens. In 1974, attorneys representing 1,281 inmates filed a class action lawsuit. They sought $2.8 billion for civil rights violations and cruel and unusual punishment during and after the retaking of the prison. It took 18 years for the case to reach trial. 18 years of delays, legal obstacles, and official resistance. In 1992, a jury ruled that the inmates' constitutional rights had been violated, but they exonerated 3 of the 4 prison officials named, holding only one deputy warden liable. The case dragged on another 8 years before reaching a settlement. In January 2000, the state paid $8 million to former inmates. That's about $6,300 per person for surviving a massacre and a week of torture. The families of slain corrections officers got even less. They'd accepted death benefit checks immediately after the riot, not knowing it waived their right to sue. State officials never informed them. They lost their loved ones, and then lost their legal recourse. The surviving hostages, who cashed their paychecks after the riot, also unknowingly gave up their right to sue. They received nothing for their trauma. In 2005, 5 years after the inmate settlement, New York finally agreed to pay $12 million to surviving corrections employees and families of those killed. It took 34 years. Here's what authorities tried to bury. Attica wasn't about violent criminals refusing to behave. It was about human beings pushed past their breaking point by a system that treated them as less than human. The warnings were there. Multiple reports before September 1971 documented the unconstitutional conditions. A federal class action lawsuit filed in 1977 by inmate Dwight Duran outlined prison grievances in 99 handwritten pages. The court sided with him, but reforms dragged on for 2 decades. The Night of the Axe Handles in 1976 showed the pattern. When inmates organized a work strike over prison conditions, Deputy Warden Robert Montoya authorized tear gas. As prisoners stumbled out coughing, guards beat them with axe handles over nearly 100 yards. Eyewitnesses, including some officials, corroborated the brutality. A federal lawsuit followed. It was still pending in 1982. This wasn't unique to Attica. New Mexico State Penitentiary exploded in 1980 in what became the most brutal prison riot in American history. 33 inmates killed, many tortured to death. The causes? Overcrowding, destroyed inmate power structures, administrative chaos, predictable, preventable. Oklahoma State Prison at McAllister erupted in 1973. Over 2,200 inmates in a facility built for 1,100. Poor training, violence from convict bosses. The prison burned, $20 million in damage. Again, overcrowding, poor conditions, ignored warnings. The pattern across American prisons was undeniable. Officials knew conditions were unconstitutional. Courts ordered changes. Administrators delayed. Prisoners rioted. Authorities responded with overwhelming force. Then they lied about what happened. What made Attica different was the exposure, the civilian observers, the journalists who witnessed negotiations, the medical examiner who refused to falsify autopsies, the legal battles that, despite delays, eventually forced some accountability. The inmates' 28 demands from Dr. read like a blueprint for basic human dignity. Better food, medical care, education programs, fair wages, due process. None of it was radical. All of it was legally required. After Attica, prisons across America did improve conditions, not because authorities suddenly developed compassion, but because Attica showed what happens when you don't. Food quality improved. Hygiene standards rose. Medical care became more accessible. Recreational and educational programs returned. But the core problem remained. American corrections is designed around punishment, not rehabilitation. Overcrowding continues. Budget cuts eliminate programs. Private prisons create financial incentives to keep cells full. The system that produced Attica still exists, just better at avoiding riots. In 2021, 50 years after the uprising, HBO released documentaries examining the massacre and its cover-up. Survivors shared their stories. Frank Big Black Smith, the head of security who protected hostages, described the week of torture after the assault. He lived with those memories until his death in 2004. Elizabeth Fink, the attorney who spent decades fighting for the inmates' legal case, exposed how state officials actively covered up police crimes. Malcolm Bell, a prosecutor on the state's own investigative team, sent a 160-page report in 1975 alleging his superiors were covering up criminal actions by law enforcement. He was reassigned and suspended for trying to pursue the truth. The only state trooper ever indicted in connection with Attica faced reckless endangerment charges for firing into a mixed crowd of inmates and hostages. Reckless endangerment, not murder, not manslaughter. He wasn't convicted. 43 people died at Attica. One corrections officer, William Quinn, was killed by inmates at the riot's start. 3 inmates were killed by other inmates in the early chaos. The remaining 39, 10 corrections employees, and 29 inmates were all killed by law enforcement. The state of New York killed more people in 4 minutes than inmates killed in 4 days. Then they lied about it. Then they tortured the survivors. Then they delayed justice for decades. Then they paid settlements without admitting wrongdoing. That's what they tried to bury. The bloodshed at Attica wasn't triggered by inmate savagery. It was triggered by years of ignored warnings, unconstitutional conditions, and a system that valued control over human dignity. The riot was predictable. The massacre was a choice. The cover-up was policy. And the question we still haven't answered: how many more Atticas are we building right now? In prisons where warnings go ignored and people are treated as less than human until the day the powder keg explodes again? The truth about Attica forced America to confront what happens inside its prisons. But some facilities learned different lessons. Instead of reform, they perfected control. And in the supermax prisons that followed, inmates would face something arguably worse than death: complete isolation, 23 hours a day, for years or even decades. That's the story nobody tells about solitary confinement. Until next time.